So we are very close to completing the tuning on our plane. The last video we did was on the sole. That was actually filmed probably 3 months ago. And since then, Sydney's had a cheeky little lockdown. Hope you're doing all right. What that means is that I'm going to have to check this sole again before I use it to make sure that it's still in good nick and hasn't moved much. I don't think it will have because we haven't been in the workshop and we haven't been running the air conditioning. So I don't think there'll be a huge difference in the shape of the block. Nevertheless, I want to push on with the Chipbreaker. The Chipbreaker is a little bit fiddly, and in this process we'll see all the elements really that we've used in the blade come together again, because we're tuning a second blade with all the same principles. And we just pop it out. Our aim for the Chipbreaker is that we are tasked with establishing a flat surface on the back of the Chipbreaker, just as we did on the plane blade, and mating those two flat surfaces to each other in the plane. We want this Chipbreaker to seat a hairline behind the blade. If this Chipbreaker is a millimetre behind the blade, it will not function. It will stop shavings from jamming under the bar, but it won't actually do anything at our cutting edge. So we want to be able to seat this Chipbreaker as closely as possible to our edge without it running over. And to do that, we need to be able to mate it perfectly to our edge. So that's the first job. When we put the Chipbreaker on our lapped back of our blade, we know that we have one surface that is dead straight and true, because we've put a lot of work into that. And as we hold it up to the light, pinching down across the bevels, we can see that we have contact in the corners, but not in the middle, which means that we have a gap between the Chipbreaker and the blade. If we were to use this right now, we would get timber fibres inserting themselves and jamming themselves between the Chipbreaker and the blade. They would then be broken off and stuck there. The blade would not be able to cut, and we'd have a very hard time getting any sort of result out of our plane, which can be a frustrating experience. So first thing we need to do is to flatten off the back of the Chipbreaker. And for this, we revisit our old friend, the Kanaban. If you've got this far in these videos, you will know the tool and you will know the process and you will know the principles at play here. So I'm just going to give this Chipbreaker a bit of a run and we'll see how close we are to flat. Again, I'm only going to do the front 5 to 10 mil, because on this Chipbreaker, interestingly enough, we have a very big hollow ground here at the back that goes all the way to the edges. There's no perimeter, there's no aura up the sides, it's only on the front. So after a little bit of work, I've got a nice flat polished finish on the back of my Chipbreaker as well, which is what we want, to mirror the flat polished finish on the back of our blade. Depending on the behaviour of your Chipbreaker once you've done that lapping, you may or may not have a burr here at the front. We don't want this Chipbreaker to be a sharp blade, but what we do want is a nice crisp edge right on the front. So what we can do, jump the gun a little bit. This is my 1000 grit stone, and I'm just going to take a couple of passes at not 90 degrees, just about 80, 75. Make sure that we don't have any burr on the front. And now that I've done that, I've created a burr on the back. So now I'm chasing my tail slightly. Go back to my Kanaban and make sure that I can deburr . If I did that on a 1000 grit stone, I'd lose my nice polish. I don't want that. There we go. So I've got a nice crisp front on my Chipbreaker. It's a very tiny area on the front of our blade that is going to present itself to the shavings as they come up off the timber. And what this is designed to do is to stop the shaving in its tracks as a shear wall and bend the shaving back on itself. So that shaving then breaks. The fibres can't lift up because the shaving is broken. So if you have fibres that want to tear out, we have a new way of managing it. They can't lift up and travel up because they've been broken by the Chipbreaker. So here we want to make sure that it's going to marry nicely to our plane blade. You may have noticed that this plane blade is not a flat surface. We have a nice flat surface here at the front of the plane blade, but here behind it, we have no control over what's been going on. That's all come from the factory, however the smith has decided to leave it. We need to remedy this by making sure that the Chipbreaker mates nicely with the blade. The chip breaker has 3 points of contact, right here at the front. On the back, that we've just flattened, is the main point of contact, and we have 2 ears at the back. These ears are probably not going to be in line with each other or in line with where they need to be to get a good finish on this good mating surface on the blade. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that I don't have a gap down the front, and I don't have a gap down the front as long as I'm putting my pressure on the bevels and squeezing the bevels. If I put this on the bench, put the bevels on top of each other, a hairline behind the front edge of the blade, and here we are going to find out what the chip breaker is doing at the back end. So if we tap one corner, we've got good contact there. If we tap the other corner, we have an ear that is not in contact with the back of the blade and is pushing down as I tap it. When that pushes down at the back, that lifts up at the front, and we create a gap between our 2 flat surfaces. So what we want is we want our front to be mated nicely, flat to flat, and our 2 back ears to be simultaneously touching the blade. What this means is that this corner that has good contact is higher than the corner that has no contact. So I need to remove a small amount of material from the corner that has good contact to bring it down in line with the other corner. To do that, we take a metal file. Normally I have an allergic reaction to these, but we'll allow it this once. Oh, see if this one's any finer. So we don't want to do much work, we don't want to remove much material, we just want to take a few passes and then check. Now we still don't have contact here, so we still need to keep removing material from this corner. So I find that a few long passes are heaps. That's solid, both of those. Great, I'm happy with that. And we're going to fit the chip breaker to the block. So what I've noticed driving in this blade is that I know that when I last left this blade, it took quite a lot to seat. I think I observed that in the video. Now, I can seat this blade in this block with a light wooden mallet. You can hear that tone rise through the pitch as well, and that's pretty much seated there. I would not have been able to do that with this mallet 2 months ago, and I think that's an interesting demonstration of how the timber in Japanese plane blocks moves. So I do know that there's been movement because of the fit of the blade. That's still a usable fit. I think I'll still be very able to get a nice result out of that. And previously, I used to tune all of my planes with a light wooden mallet. However, if I'd tuned this a couple of months ago with a light wooden mallet, that blade would now be dropping all the way through, and I wouldn't have any control over its depth. So tuning it initially with a large-ish, I mean this is a bit larger than what I used, but a nice heavy metal hammer, about 375 grams is probably a good range. Gives you a bit of tolerance to safety in terms of if anything happens with the block moving, you won't necessarily have a blade that drops too far. This chip breaker is dropping quite a long way, and I think we'll be able to work with that in this for the most part. However, in other planes, that might not be the case. So in this smaller 48mm, as I look down the chip breaker, I can see that there is a lot of contact patch between the pin and the chip breaker itself. There's a little bit of light on the sides, but it is not dropping very far, even as I try and tap it. For the purpose of the video, this plane is quite an interesting example, because as you drop this chip breaker, you actually get a gap in the middle between the bar and the chip breaker. So the chip breaker is contacting the bar on the sides, but not necessarily in the middle. So if I wanted to relieve this bar to drop the chip breaker a bit further, I would work the sides of the bar rather than the center. Because this chip breaker is dropping as a wedge, any work we do to this bar only needs to be minimal in order to make a difference. So we're just going to do a small amount of work and guess and check. So here on my little 48mm, what I would like to be able to do is mate up the chip breaker and the blade and then drop them both simultaneously. And I want the flats of both the chip breaker and the blade to travel down into the block with each other. So I'll impact the blade, drive it down a couple of mil and impact the chip breaker. and drive it down to match. This is why the Chipbreaker can be slightly fiddly. So the reason I feel this is the safest is that if I was to drive the blade home to its final position and then drive the Chipbreaker, if there's a lot of pressure on the Chipbreaker, it has to bridge across the hollow ground of the blade. So if you're putting a lot of pressure on that Chipbreaker, because it has to bridge that hollow ground, sometimes it can come to mirror that hollow ground. And so instead of a nice flat front edge of the Chipbreaker, you end up with a bent Chipbreaker. However, if you have a light set on your Chipbreaker, that shouldn't be an issue, and you can bed your blade and then bed your Chipbreaker. So on this plane, these are getting quite tight, and I'm still about 3 mils from protruding in this blade, so I'm going to pull this back out. It's really important to keep a hold of both of them because the Chipbreaker will generally let go first once you're driving it out of the plane block, and then the blade, but sometimes they come all at once and at the same time. So I want to create a flat spot on the bottom of this bar. I take a metal file, it might be a small one, might be a larger one, whatever you have and feel comfortable using. And the key here is to work gently and to make sure that driving forward, the file is not going to impact the mouth of the plane. If we start knocking around the mouth of the plane block, we can compromise the performance of our plane. So I'm going to, and because we're creating metal filings here, I wouldn't want to do this on any nice bench or anything like that. This is back to metalwork again. So with my finger, I can see and I can feel a small flat spot that I've developed on the bottom of that bar. Dropping the blade, dropping the Chipbreaker, and away we go. So I've now got that blade protruding, and I need to take the same care in bedding the blade nice and square as I would normally, and I want to drive home the Chipbreaker. So as I do the final adjustments on the Chipbreaker, it can be really hard to see what's going on. And there are a few factors. In this plane block here, I've got a really tight mouth. And what that means is that from the top, it can be very hard to see where the Chipbreaker is going to position itself. Here I've got a lower kopogaishi, which is the area in front of the mouth, and so I actually have a bit of visual access to what's going on. And so here on this one, I want to bed this just so it's a hairline behind the blade. And sometimes it's easier to take, again, a small light or a mobile phone light and get it underneath your plane and get the light to reflect off the bevel of the back of your blade or the bevel of the Chipbreaker. So with the light behind it, my main blade presents as a black line and the bevel of the Chipbreaker is reflective, and that helps me to see whereabouts I'm situated. So I think that Chipbreaker is close enough for the purposes of the video that I'll move back to this plane. It's going to be a bit harder to see with this plane what's going on because the mouth is tighter. However, I'm just going to make sure that that Chipbreaker is about where I want it and that the blade's where I want it. And I know that this Chipbreaker is fitting because this blade is now not driving down as I hammer it as easily as it did before I put the Chipbreaker in. So with this Chipbreaker set tightly to the edge of the blade, what I'm finding is that the back of the Chipbreaker bevel is fouling on the mouth of the plane. The mouth is actually at an angle that is more acute than the Chipbreaker may have been ground for. And what that means is that shaving can't pass through. Even though the blade's in a good position to take a shaving, the blade takes a beautiful shaving without the Chipbreaker in it. The Chipbreaker, introducing the Chipbreaker, I can't get it close enough to be effective without clogging the mouth. And I think we're back to the fact that this block was not made for this blade set. So I think I'm going to have to make another video on that. However, hopefully, if you have a block that is made for your blade set, something like this, you'll now be able to get really good results from your Japanese plane. There are a couple of extra bits of information that I have not included in these videos so far, and even though we've just called this a 5-part series, we will be doing a couple of extra quick videos to cover some more information. If you're having trouble troubleshooting your plane, you might want to watch those along with us, but if you're getting good results, congratulations, enjoy your plane, And if you have any questions about them, give us a call or an email. Enjoy woodworking.